It's 3 in the morning. You are standing in the middle of a dark room, swaying from side to side, holding a small, screaming creature that will not stop. You have tried everything. You fed it, you changed it, you bounced, shushed, and walked slow laps around a coffee table until your back ached. The creature does not care. Your phone glows face up on the counter with a search you typed with one thumb. Why won't my baby sleep? And everywhere else in the building, everyone is asleep. It is just you, one tired adult, one tiny furious human, and the entire job of keeping it alive resting on your shoulders alone. If you have ever lived that exact moment, hold on to the feeling for a second, because here is the strange part. For almost the whole history of our species, that scene, one exhausted adult, alone, in the dark, with a baby, would have been close to impossible. Not frowned upon, not unusual, nearly impossible. You were never supposed to do this by yourself. That lonely apartment at 3 in the morning feels normal to us now. It is one of the most unnatural things a human parent has ever tried to do. And to understand why, you have to look at the single most helpless animal on the planet, which happens to be you, about 30 seconds after you were born. Let's start with a question nobody bothers to ask. Why is a human baby so uselessly, dangerously fragile in the first place? Because it really is an outlier. A baby giraffe drops almost 2 meters to the ground, wobbles upright, and is walking within an hour. A foal is standing on 4 legs before you could finish a coffee. Even a newborn chimpanzee, our closest living relative, can grip its mother's fur and hang on within minutes. Your nearest cousin comes out of the womb already knowing how to hold on. You came out knowing how to do essentially nothing. A human newborn cannot walk, cannot crawl, cannot lift its own head with any confidence, cannot feed itself, and cannot keep its own body at a safe temperature. It has no concept of danger. It has never met a predator, but every predator in the neighborhood knows exactly what it is. You weighed about 3 kilograms, and you were, to put it kindly, a soft, warm, noise-making problem waiting to happen. And this is not a bug in the design. It is the design. The anthropologist Sherwood Washburn gave this trade-off a name back in 1960. He called it the obstetric dilemma, and it comes down to a fight between 2 body parts. On one side, your enormous brain. On the other, the human pelvis, which had to stay narrow enough to walk and run upright. A fully finished human brain would need a skull far too large to ever pass through the birth canal. So evolution picked a grim compromise. It shipped you early. Human babies are, in a real sense, born premature by default. At birth, your brain is only about a quarter of its adult size. A newborn chimp is already sitting at close to half. All that missing brain wiring, the part other animals finish inside the safety of the womb, we have to build out in the open air, over years, while the baby is completely exposed and completely dependent on other people. Scientists have a dry term for being born this underdeveloped: secondary altriciality. In plain speech, it means you arrived as a rough draft. The rest of you got written later, outside. So here is the trap our ancestors were handed. Their species produced the most helpless infant of any primate, one that could not survive alone for even a few hours, and yet somehow they kept a chain of these creatures alive, one after another, for 300,000 years without a single break. Break the chain once and you are not here. How do you keep something that fragile alive when you also have to find food, walk for kilometers, and survive a world full of teeth? The first answer is almost embarrassingly simple. You never put it down. Think about the problem for a moment. You are a mother in the deep past. You need to gather roots and berries, which means walking several kilometers a day across rough ground. You cannot leave the baby at home because there is no home and there is no one guarding it. You cannot set it on the grass because it cannot regulate its own heat, and a cold baby can fade shockingly fast. And a baby crying alone in the open is a dinner bell for anything with an appetite. So you carry it, constantly, against your body, all day. We now call this baby wearing, and treat it like a trendy parenting choice. It is nothing of the sort. It is the oldest childcare method our species has, and your own body still carries the evidence. Stroke the palm of a newborn and its fingers clamp shut with a grip strong enough to briefly support its own weight. That reflex has no obvious use in a crib. It makes total sense if you picture a baby who, for a very long time, needed to cling to a moving caregiver and not fall off. There is harder data behind this than reflexes. In 1986, the pediatric researchers Urs and Ronald Barr ran a study on infant crying and found something almost funny in how simple it was. Babies who were carried more, for a couple of extra hours a day, cried and fussed dramatically less, by roughly half. Not because carrying spoiled them, because being held is what the infant body is expecting. Isolation is the thing it reads as an emergency, and it goes deeper than mood. Skin-to-skin contact does real physical work. In Bogota, Colombia in 1978, two doctors named Edgar Ray and Hector Martinez were facing a shortage of incubators for premature babies, so they tried something out of desperation. They strapped the infants directly against their mothers' bare chests, upright, all day. It worked. The contact steadied the baby's heart rates, their breathing, and their body temperature. The technique got a name, kangaroo care, and it is now used in hospitals around the world. The lesson underneath it is older than any hospital. A human infant against a human body is not being coddled, it is being regulated. So the baby is carried, fine, but carrying does not feed it. What was the ancient feeding schedule actually like? Here is where our idea of normal falls apart completely. We picture feeding as a tidy event, a bottle, a set time, a few neat sessions a day. Now look at what the anthropologists Richard Lee, Melvin Connor, and Marjorie Shostak recorded among the Juhoansi, sometimes called the Kung, in the Kalahari Desert through the 1960s and 70s. Those mothers nursed their babies as often as 4 times an hour, in short bursts, day and night, for years. Not 4 times a day, 4 times an hour. Let that sit for a second. Nearly constant contact and nearly constant feeding, stretched across 2, 3, sometimes 4 years for a single child. That rhythm was doing 3 jobs at once. It fed the baby, it calmed the baby, since a nursing infant is a settled infant. And it quietly did something no one planned but everyone depended on. Frequent nursing suppressed the mother's ovulation, which naturally spaced her children roughly 4 years apart. No calendars, no clinics. Just biology buying enough time to carry one helpless child close to independence before the next one arrived. And when a mother could not feed her own child because she was sick or absent or had died, other women in the group often nursed the baby for her. Sharing the feeding of an infant that isn't yours turns out to be ancient and turns up across cultures all over the world. A hungry baby was not always one woman's private problem. Sometimes it was the group's, which raises a question that quietly changes everything. If other women were feeding the baby, holding the baby, watching the baby, then whose baby was it really? This is where the whole story flips over, and where you meet the single most important idea in it. For most of the animal kingdom, a mother raises her young more or less alone. The father might loiter nearby. The core burden falls on one body. This puts a hard ceiling on things, because one mother can only carry and feed so many dependent young at once. Humans smash straight through that ceiling, and the person who explained how is the anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy in her 2009 book Mothers and Others. Her argument is that humans are what biologists call cooperative breeders. We evolved to raise children as a group task, with the mother at the center of a ring of other helpers: grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, fathers, family friends. Hrdy calls those extra caregivers alloparents, other parents. And she makes the case that without them, our lineage simply could not have afforded such expensive, slow-growing, helpless babies at all. Now here is the part nobody tells you, and it is the counterintuitive heart of this whole thing. If a baby has to win over not one caregiver but several, then the baby needs to be good at something. It needs to be good at people. Hrdy's striking suggestion is that our deepest social talents, reading a face, tracking whether someone is pleased with us, charming an audience, sharing to keep the peace, may have been sharpened precisely because human infants spent hundreds of thousands of years auditioning for the attention of many caregivers at once. The chubby cheeks, the babbling, the heart-melting smile that appears right around the time strangers start holding you. That is not decoration. That may be a recruitment strategy. Read that back. The baby is not a passive bundle being kept alive by the group. The baby is an active little diplomat, evolved to make a whole ring of people fall for it. Our empathy, our obsession with what others feel, might be the fingerprint that childcare left on the human mind. And one alloparent turns out to matter more than almost any other. The grandmother. In the 1990s, the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, watching Hadza foragers in Tanzania, noticed the older women were not resting. They were out digging tubers, hauling food, and pouring it straight into their grandchildren. From this, she built the grandmother hypothesis, and it tries to solve a genuine mystery. Human women are one of the very few animals on Earth that live for decades after they stop being able to reproduce. Menopause is biologically weird. Why keep a body running long past its baby-making years? Hawkes's answer is that an experienced grandmother was worth more to the group as a helper than as a mother. Evolution, in effect, found it more efficient to switch older women off from having their own babies and switch them onto keeping everyone else's alive. And the hard numbers back the instinct. In 2008, the researchers Rebecca Sear and Ruth Mace reviewed dozens of studies across many traditional societies and found that in a large share of them, the presence of a maternal grandmother measurably improved a child's odds of surviving. In some populations, grandma nearby was one of the strongest predictors of whether a child saw its third birthday at all. Here is my honest opinion, and it is worth saying plainly. The lonely nuclear household, the one adult pacing at 3 in the morning, is not the natural state of human parenting. It is an experiment. A very recent one, and we are the test subjects. And it wasn't only grandmothers carrying the load. Fathers pulled real weight too, more than the modern stereotype gives them. The anthropologist Barry Hewlett spent years living with the Aka people of Central Africa and published his findings in 1991. He measured how close Aka fathers stayed to their infants and found they were within arm's reach of their babies roughly 47% of the time. 47%. That is more hands-on than a great many fathers in wealthy modern countries manage today, from inside a culture we would probably call primitive. So let's stop talking in theory and actually reconstruct a morning. Picture a Juhonzi camp in the Kalahari, not long after dawn. A mother wakes with her baby already against her skin, because it slept there. She nurses it half awake. Then the day begins to move. She hands the baby to her own mother while she ties up a carrying sling. An older cousin, maybe 7 years old, jogs over and holds the baby on her hip, bouncing it, pulling faces, while the adults sort out who is gathering where. An aunt takes a turn. The baby's father drifts past, crouches, lets it grip his finger. By midday, that infant may have passed through 4 or 5 sets of hands, all of them attentive, none of them strangers, and it has not been alone or out of arm's reach for a single minute. No one in that camp is burning out doing this. That is the whole trick. The exhaustion is spread so thin across so many people that it barely registers on any single one of them. The baby is not one person's crisis. It is the group's shared, easy background hum. Now hold that picture. We will need it later. Eventually, though, the baby has to eat something other than milk, and this is where ancient childcare gets a little gross and a lot smarter than it looks. There were no soft first foods waiting on a shelf, no pureed carrot in a pouch. There was whatever the group had dug up or brought down that day, and it was mostly too tough for a toothless mouth. So caregivers used the tool they had, their own teeth. Across a huge range of traditional societies, adults chewed food into a soft paste and passed it, mouth, to the infant. The anthropologist Gretel Pelto and her colleagues, in a review published in 2010, documented just how widespread this practice, called premastication, really is, and pointed out that chimpanzees do a version of it too, which means it is probably older than our species entirely. It sounds unhygienic. It does move an adult's mouth bacteria into the baby, but here is the twist, and stay with me, because it is a good one. Some of those transferred microbes may actually help. Handing a baby a starter kit of an adult's mouth bacteria could give its developing immune system something to practice on. The disgusting thing might have been a quiet gift, and the payoff shows up in the bones. The bioarchaeologist Clark Spencer Larson has spent a career reading ancient skeletons, and one of the clearest patterns he and others find is this. Forager children, eating a wild mix of marrow, mashed plants, eggs, fish, and scraps of meat, often had better teeth and fewer cavities than the children who came after them, the early farmers whose diets collapsed onto soft, sugary, starchy grains. Read that again, because it flips the story we tell about progress. Agriculture is supposed to be the great leap forward. For a young child's mouth, it was often a step down. The hunter-gatherer kid, chewing on wild everything, had a healthier smile than the farming kid living on bread. Sometimes moving forward is really moving back. But eating is a daytime problem. What happened when the sun went down? Here is another thing our world got backwards. In the ancient environment, nobody slept alone, especially not a baby. In effectively every forager society ever studied, and across most traditional cultures on record, infants and small children sleep in direct contact with an adult body. Not in a separate room, not in a crib down the hall, skin against skin, or close to it, all night long. The anthropologist James McKenna, who ran a mother-infant sleep lab at the University of Notre Dame for decades, has argued that this shared sleep is not just cozy, it may be functional. His work suggests that the steady sound and movement of a sleeping adult's breathing gives a baby's own unsteady breathing rhythm something to lock onto during the fragile early months when that rhythm can still stall. The private nursery, the baby alone in its own dark room, is a blink of an eye invention. For something like 99% of human history, a sleeping baby was a baby pressed against another living, breathing person. Our infants' bodies still seem to expect that. We just stopped providing it and called the new way normal. So the picture is filling in. Carried all day, nursed constantly, passed between many loving hands, fed from an adult's own mouth, asleep against a warm body every night, surrounded always by people. And yet, here is the part we cannot look away from. For most of human history, an enormous number of these deeply loved children still died. The researchers Anthony Volk and Jeremy Atkinson, in a 2013 study, estimated that in ancient populations, somewhere between a third and a half of all children died before the age of 5. Sit with that. Not because their parents failed them, and not because they were careless, because there were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no clean water on tap, no way to stop a bad infection or replace the fluids lost to a few days of illness. They were doing everything right, with almost nothing to work with. And they tried. They tried hard. In a cave called El Cedrón in Spain, the scientist Karen Hrdy and her team, in 2012, examined the hardened plaque on Neanderthal teeth and found traces of yarrow and chamomile, plants with a bitter taste and no real food value, but with medicinal properties. These were creatures reaching for herbal medicine tens of thousands of years ago. Later, in ancient Egypt, the medical text known as the Ebers Papyrus, from around 1550 BC, recorded honey as a wound dressing, and honey genuinely does fight bacteria. None of this could stop a child dying of severe dehydration, but it was not nothing. It was a species swinging at the dark with the only tools it had. And when the child died anyway, they grieved. We know this because they buried their children with care. At a site called Sunghir in Russia, tens of thousands of years old, archaeologists found the graves of children laid to rest covered in thousands of hand-carved ivory beads, beads that would have taken enormous effort to make. You do not spend that on a child you did not love. The old idea that ancient people shrugged off dead babies because life was cheap is contradicted by the ground itself. Again and again, they mourned. Then they got up and kept the next one alive. So let me hold up the two pictures this whole story has been building toward, side by side, because the gap between them is the point. On one side, a Kalahari mother, her baby handed between 4 sets of hands before noon, never once alone, wrapped in a ring of people so thick that no single one of them ever has to carry the weight by themselves. On the other side, you, in that dark apartment, at 3 in the morning, alone, same helpless infant, same species, the exact same 3-kilogram bundle that has needed the exact same things for 300,000 years. Everything is identical except one thread, and it is the thread that mattered most. The ring of people is gone. Here is where honesty matters, because it would be easy to get preachy and wrong. We are not living in some fallen age. The collapse of child death is the greatest thing our species has ever done. Since the year 1800, according to the data gathered by the researcher Max Roser, child mortality has fallen by around 96%. 96%. A child born today is safer than at any point in the whole human story. Nobody sane wants to trade that back for herbs and honey and a 1 in 3 chance of losing a 5-year-old. That progress is sacred. Keep it. But we did 2 things at once, and only noticed one of them. We beat the diseases. That part we understand. And at the same time, almost by accident, we dismantled the other machine. The dense social ring, the alloparents, the grandmothers within reach, the many hands. Urbanization, families scattered across countries, both parents at work. The extended family shrunk down to a household of 2 adults, or sometimes 1. None of that happened because anyone decided babies would be better off. It happened for reasons that had nothing to do with children at all, and it left a lot of parents doing, alone, a job that our species was very specifically built to do together. We do not fully know the cost of that. That is the honest answer. But the signs are not subtle. The rates of postpartum depression, of crushing parental burnout, of that specific bone-deep loneliness of new parents, they are high, and they are real, and they are strangest exactly in the wealthiest, most isolated households. Maybe that is a coincidence, or maybe a body built to be surrounded feels the absence of the ring more than we admit. The ancient answer to how you keep a child alive was never really a list of techniques. It was one sentence. You do not do it alone. You do not even do it as a couple. You do it as a group, so that no single tired adult is ever the only thing standing between a baby and the dark. So think about your own 3 in the morning, whether you have lived it yet or not, and think about who was or wasn't in the room. If you carry one thing away from all of this, let it be the least ancient-sounding thing of all. The next time a new parent looks wrecked, do not send a card. Show up. Hold the baby for an hour so they can shower or sleep, or simply sit in a quiet room and remember their own name. That is not a nice gesture. That is you, briefly, becoming an alloparent, stepping into a role your ancestors filled for one another every single day for 300,000 years. You would be rejoining the oldest survival system our species ever built. Because the ancient humans had no antibiotics, no hospitals, no formula, no pediatricians, no monitors glowing in the dark. What they had was each other, and a baby held by many hands almost never cries in an empty room. Now I want to hear from you. Who was in your ring, the person who showed up at 3 in the morning when you needed them, for a baby or for anything? Tell me about them in the comments. I read these. If this changed how you see that lonely apartment even a little, subscribe and stay with us. Next time, we are going even further back. Take care of each other out there.